Hello and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shannon Curry. I'm a vice president here at Benenson Strategy Group. We want to thank you for joining us. We're really excited about today's event. As you all know, the election is 6 days away, and today we are thrilled to host a conversation between two former presidential campaign strategists, Joel Benenson and Kevin Madden. A brief intro to our speakers. Joel Benenson is the founder and CEO of Benenson Strategy Group. Joel has been a leading political strategist and pollster for decades. Most notably, he led the award-winning research and polling programs for President Obama's 2008 and 2012 campaigns. Throughout his career, he has been a trusted advisor to heads of state, political leaders, Fortune 100 companies, their CEOs, and leaders of major advocacy and nonprofit institutions. Kevin Madden is an executive vice president for advocacy at the Arnold Ventures, one of the country's leading public policy foundations. Kevin served as Mitt Romney's senior strategist for his 2008 and 2012 presidential campaigns. In addition to his national campaign experience, Kevin was a top congressional leadership staffer in the US House of Representatives, serving as spokesman and communication strategist in the office of the House Majority Leader. A few housekeeping items to note before we begin. This event is scheduled for 45 minutes. There will be plenty of time for Q&A at the end. If you have a question for Joel or Kevin or both, simply put it in the chat box and we will try to get to it. Other than that, sit back and enjoy.
Great. Thanks, Shannon. And thank you all for joining. And a special thanks to my friend Kevin, who reminded me this morning that the first time we did a panel together was 10 years ago in 2010. And we've done countless since then. In groups where Democrats and Republicans join and have these kinds of conversations. We want to go quickly here so we can get to your questions as much as possible, but we've got some territory to cover about our views on the campaign and our perspectives. Kevin, I want to start with you, and then I'll give you my view on this. But what do you see as the biggest factor shaping the political environment between the 2016 campaign and the contest that we're having today?
Well, first of all, thank you to everybody for joining. Thank you, Shannon, for the introduction, and thanks, Joel, for inviting me. You probably didn't tell everybody about how mean you were to me back in 2012, because we weren't yet technically friends, but now that we are, now that we've spilled enough blood on the battlefield. So that's a good question, and the evolution of the electorate and its psyche, I think, over the last 4 years has been an important story to, and I think it will really, importantly define some of the results next week. But I think if you look back at 2016, the main thing that was driving the electorate psyche back then was this anti-establishment fervor, right? Which is, no matter how many people you asked, the common thread or the through line on the support that was ultimately for Trump could be traced back to the idea that he wasn't a typical politician, right? He was somebody who was outside the system, and we needed to shake the system up. And none of that was really driven by ideology. Like, a lot of it wasn't about his policy platform as far as the consistency on a policy platform or an adherence to a traditional Republican conservative view on big issues. But instead it was, I'm tired of all the old politicians. I want something new. I want somebody to turn Washington upside down, and somebody who's sort of going to be, quote, on my side. And that on my side thing, I'd say that's pretty consistent with how past presidential candidates have won. I mean, Barack Obama won the he's on your side contest in 2012, and very much so in 2008 as well. So that was the most powerful, I think, element that was pressurizing the electorate back then. Fast forward, and by the way, it wasn't just in the United States, Joel, right? Like, we've talked about this previously.
Right.
It wasn't just about Washington, D.C. and a animosity towards Washington, D.C. We were registering animosity with Brexit in London and Berlin and France and elsewhere around the globe. That was a common sort of through line. And then you fast forward to 2016, and it's right now what we're looking at is essentially a judgment of the performance of the anti-establishment crowd. And when you have the election now being framed by three big events, and usually it's really one big event that defines an election, but this is an election that is being defined by a pandemic. It's being defined by the resulting economic fallout from that pandemic. And then this overwhelming sense of social unrest that can be tied directly to, I think, racial injustice and just partisan disunity overall that's sort of tearing at the fabric of the country. Those are the three big things that are shaping this electorate right now. And quite frankly, I mean, as you look at the daily news cycle, Hunter Biden, ad spending in states, this gaffe, that gaffe, the rest of that is all noise. None of that is moving the needle the way any attention to those three big issues will.
Right. Well, I have a mantra that I've kind of developed over the decades of working on presidential campaigns that I talk about all the time with candidates when I'm working for them and not. And I think it reflects some of what you're talking about. I think presidential campaigns are always about big things, not small things. They're about the future, not the past. And they're about their lives, not your life. And that doesn't mean that a candidate's bio doesn't matter, but it means ultimately you have to talk about the things that resonate with them, the struggles they're living with every day, in order to connect with them around the values and the attitudes that they're coming to the table with in this contest. And if you don't connect with those things, that's when you're going to have a problem. I think, looking back before we get to this campaign, reflects a little bit on this campaign. It's generally considered that incumbents have an advantage, and typically they do. When we look back at the last 120 years, I think we've only had about 19 or 20 presidents who have sought re-election, but only 5 have lost in their re-election. So there is a proclivity here to stay with the person you know. Now, this dynamic might be a little bit different. It's not unlike 2012 and President Obama's election campaign to some extent, but there are some significant differences. We were very cognizant in 2012. We were still in the wake of the financial crisis. We never overplayed the success we had. We never talked about the unemployment rate having been cut in half since he took office, because it didn't resonate with where people's economic lives are at. And I think that's a big difference with where we are today in this campaign, where I think Donald Trump, finds it impossible to modulate rather than overstate. And I think when you're running in a campaign like this as an incumbent, I think he's creating a disadvantage for himself, and he's not been able to leverage the advantages of incumbency as much. Kevin, you ran a campaign against an incumbent in 2012. Our theory here was you guys wanted to make it a referendum on us, and our job was to make it a forward-looking choice based on a contrast of economic vision and economic values. Couldn't get away from the economy, but we had to find a way to talk about it differently from the way you guys were. How do you see that playing out here in this campaign? Is Trump finding a way to inoculate himself in any way, shape, or form that you've seen, or is he just digging the hole deeper every day?
Well, that's a good question. The thing I'd point out, though, when you were talking about the Obama in 2012, and this is something that any communications professional should adopt, right, which is the most important thing that the Obama campaign did in 2012 on the issue of the economy, which had its ups and downs during that time, but was slightly trending upwards all the way, was what I call credibility in the challenge. So they never went out and said, like what you see Trump doing, which is we have the greatest economy in the history of mankind, right? And then having very difficult expectations to match when you have the bottom drop out of the economy the way it has in the result of the pandemic. Instead, the Obama campaign recognized that the visionary candidate and the candidate that was optimistic always wins. And so much of the communications programming and the political programming was designed with that in mind. So you bring that, which brings us to your question about what has Trump done in this? Like Trump's natural advantage here, I think, as an incumbent, was first of all the ability to build a campaign operation while everybody else was still in the startup mode during the Democratic primary. And the analogy I'd use of having worked on the 2004 reelect for President Bush, and then having worked on two of Romney's campaigns in 2008 and 2012, is an incumbent protection campaign or reelection campaign is like being on an ocean liner, and an incumbent campaign is like being on a pirate ship. They're just very different attitudes. They're very different organizational sort of imperatives, right? And what Trump had here with that head start on fundraising and organizational ability was he could have shaped the contours of the race, and instead of having it be a referendum on him, the incumbent, during a difficult time of a pandemic and an economic recession, he could have made it more of a choice and a contrast with Joe Biden and defined Joe Biden very early on. The problem and the biggest mistake that the president made was that because he looks at this world not as a political candidate, but instead as an executive producer of a constantly changing cable news program, and he's trying to reprogram the next 30 minutes, every 30 minutes, almost like a goldfish going around the fishbowl. He could never not make it about him. Like he couldn't resist making himself the central character in this contest, when what he needed to do was define Biden and make it more of a contrast, make it more of a choice. And that was why I think he finds himself in this very difficult polling environment right now. With any metric right now of the metrics that we have in our hand, he's behind in the race with 1 week to go.
Yeah, and it's funny. The thing that I've seen in Trump is, and I think this goes to what you're talking about in terms of ego, narcissism, having to put himself front and center, is that he's lacking in any reparative skills. One of the things that President Obama did so well in 2012 was he was able to talk to people about what their challenges were, what their pain was economically. You now have, I love Fox News polling, by the way, for everybody who's watching. I think Fox News actually has the best media polls out there. But you've got 2/3 of the people in the latest Fox News poll, or the penultimate one, that say the economy is only fair or poor. Every day Donald Trump goes out and talks about the fact that he's built the greatest economy America's ever had, he's digging a hole for himself, because not only is it on its face not correct, but it's just so out of touch with how people are thinking and what they're feeling in their economic lives. When you throw COVID into the mix, he continues to double down. I find it, I don't find it remarkable given how we've seen him behave over the last couple of years, but I just don't see that he's ever found a pathway to make a connection outside of his base. And my view of presidential elections, Kevin, is that, and I don't know if you agree with this, but they're ultimately about those 12 to 14, 15% of voters who are truly swing voters. And if you don't win those, you're not going to win. Neither party has a big enough base just to win a presidential election with its base. I don't know if you see it the same way or not.
I do. I think one of your points, though, too, is one of the greatest assets of any incumbent president is the awesome platform you have to seize during times of national emergency or crisis in order to rally everybody, regardless of whether or not they're part of your political base, around the flag and the idea of national unity. And the president from and if you look back at Oklahoma City, you look back at, a lot of the different flashpoints that we've had in the country where presidents had to do that, you saw incredible political benefits as a result. And with this president, right away from the very beginning, he didn't take that opportunity and instead doubled down on partisanship and doubled down on only talking to his base. And as a result, it was a huge missed opportunity for them. And I think it goes back to your other point too, which is that credibility in the challenge. If he had done what Obama did and what other presidents did and said, this is a time of important challenges in the country. We're not going to get through this unless we get through together. Work with Congress, work with members of both parties to address some of the big issues. That would have had a bigger impact on that 10 to 12%, right? And I think on the 10 to 12%, Joel, I'd even sort of drill down even more. We're talking probably about anywhere between 300,000 to 400,000 voters in about 6 or 7 states that are going to make or break whether or not you have the electoral votes to win. And I don't think they looked at it that way. And that is the bargain that you make when you work on a campaign that is led by President Trump. And the hardest question I always used to get from reporters is like, so if you're advising the White House, what would you say? And I'm like, well, what they should do and what they should do and what the president will do, there is a massive canyon between those two questions. And I really don't know how to bridge it. And I tell you the truth, I don't think there's anybody on the campaign that does, because President Trump is the candidate, he's the strategy, he's the message, he's the vehicle. And you have staffers on this campaign that are essentially learning about the message, the strategy, and the overall direction of the campaign by looking at their phone and reading it on Twitter, just like you or me.
So I'm going to stick with what you just said and ask a question. I want you to answer it first. I got some thoughts on it, but we're 6 days out from this election. Normally, you're in a closing phase. You're reinforcing everything you've said going forward, right? But given what you just said, if Trump keeps doing what he's done going forward, he's going to lose. I don't know that you said that definitively, but the implication is there. What would you tell each of these candidates to do in the next 6 days? And then I'll give you my answers.
Well, I think they're both doing it, but it's not out of smart strategy. I think for Trump, it's not out of smart strategy. I think it's a result of necessity. Like, they're at a point now where they can't change direction. So the president's not going to all of a sudden change a tone, change a tenor, and reach across the aisle away from his base to the big middle of the American electorate. Like, it's too late. So what he has to do really is deepen his base, which is get them to build them almost to a frenzy, and to and activate them as much as possible, so that those pockets where he had the strongest showings in the most important battleground states, that the hidden Trump vote comes out. And the message that he had that got them in 2016, or the message where they were at least buoyed throughout the better part of his presidency until COVID hit, the immigration message, the trade message, the don't let the conventional politicians tell you what to do or how to vote. Instead, vote for someone who's going to continue to disrupt the system. That's really, I think, the only political salvation that he has right now. Biden, on the other hand, recognizes and has read, and the campaign has read the swing voter electorate perfectly, which is that the majority of people who are the persuadables in this country, that most of all, the one thing that they really, really want is some sense of normalcy. They want essentially a national political bomb put on their burn. And so a steady hand, unity, bringing things back to normal, a message focused on that, and a message that is optimistic and hopeful. The way I would describe it is, I would say, let's reverse engineer from the moment you stand and take the oath of office on January 20th, 2021. What's the message that you want people to hear in order to feel for the first time in a long time, optimistic and hopeful about the direction of the country? Deliver that message every single day for the next 6 days.
I got to say, I think this would sound like it's a Hail Mary, and it's probably not within Trump's capability to do it. But he'd have to be able to deliver some kind of serious mea culpa, acknowledge mistakes, and promise some significant change going forward. I think if he had done that a couple of weeks ago, he might have had some credibility on it. But I think he kept reinforcing his negatives. To me, one of the key disasters of this campaign for Donald Trump was the first debate. I've never seen a president show off his negatives as much as Donald Trump did in that debate. And it cost him, and Biden moved after that. There's no question at this point, 6 days out, the qualities that are required here are qualities that Joe Biden is embodying. I've been asked repeatedly, who would you rather be? And this is over the last 4 weeks, I would say, Donald Trump or Joe Biden. And my answer is Joe Biden. The number one issue that is dominating conversations at the dinner table in every household, anytime families or friends can meet, even if they're social distancing, is coronavirus. You have 1 out of 4 people over the age of 50, 1 out of 4 over the age of 50 who say they know someone who has died from this virus. And it's the thing that Donald Trump has denied throughout. His inability to recognize it has created a massive disconnect. For Joe Biden, I think what he has to do is keep demonstrating his compassion, his empathy. In fact, Fox News, again, I'll cite another poll, asked about a month ago how much each of these candidates did they have the compassion and empathy that we need in a president. Trump's numbers were 12 points underwater. Biden's were about 20% higher, right? People see him as compassionate. They see him as decent. That debate was a disaster for Trump. And then canceling the second debate only made him look more petulant once again. And so I think what Joe Biden has to do is to bring this home, which I think he will, is continue not to take Trump's bait, not to answer the nonsense about, oh, he's in his basement and, all of this stuff about his son, but keep driving the point about the need to restore decency and respect in America across the country and to each other. Those are his strengths. And those are also his clearest contrast on personal qualities from a president who's torn the country apart. And it speaks to the issue of coronavirus, which in every poll I've seen, people say is going to be the most important factor in their vote. Yeah. And I think to play offense here, even however limited his campaigns are, I think he has to drive that contrast. We call it sometimes, Kevin, you've heard me say it, the implicit contrast. He doesn't have to tear Donald Trump. Donald Trump's doing it to himself. I think if he stays on the high grounds, the dividends are paying off. Let me share some numbers for a second.
And you know what, Joel, just on that point?
Yeah.
It's going to be critically important for day after election all the way through to inauguration, because we're at a partisan zenith right now. So anybody who wins, I think, has to have that as their focus, because it's key to building any political capital that they're going to need in order to sort of repair some of the breaches that we see right now in the political system.
Yeah, that's a great point. I have to say, I always laugh when Trump, tries to taunt Biden about campaigning in it from his basement. I mean, across America, we all feel like we've been chained to our basements for the last 9 months. People can understand why that's happening. I think Biden has turned this to his advantage with some really important groups. I want to share them because they go to the long-term political landscape, I think. But Donald Trump in 2016 carried suburban voters. Now, understand, everybody, suburban voters comprise 49% of the electorate in this country. So obviously it's going to vary from state to state, but half the electorate comes from the suburbs. Donald Trump won voters in the suburbs by 4 points in 2016. Today, and again, I rely on Fox polls because I do think they're the best out there in the terms of the media polls. Right now, Joe Biden leads Donald Trump by 20 points among suburban voters. And that's not just suburban women. And imagine how many more women Donald Trump lost when he referred to suburban housewives, a total lack of understanding of what the composition of families are across American suburbs. The other group, and Kevin, I wonder what your view would be on this, because this is a group that has been important for Republicans. In 2016, Donald Trump won white non-college voters. Now, but non-college means you don't have a college degree. You may have attended, a year, you may have attended 2 years, but you didn't complete a degree. Donald Trump won white non-college voters in 2016 by 37 points. Today, he's leading that group by only 14 points. Now, that's relevant, not just in terms of national polls, but I think when you get into some of these battleground states where that cohort becomes more important, the Pennsylvanias, Wisconsin, Michigan, some of the other kind of Rust Belt states, upper Midwest states, Iowa, things like that. Those numbers, were you familiar with those numbers, Kevin? Did they surprise you?
I've been obsessing over the numbers, and I always try to tell people it's not winning those rural, working class, non-college voters, right? It's narrowing the gap. The narrowing the gap is where made the difference between losing in 2016 and winning in 2018. The other cohort, or the other numbers, I'm sorry, were older voters plus 65, and the gap that was narrowed there. And then I think the intensity of younger voters in some of these states are also I think that's going to help build more towards a big blue wave than maybe many of us are predicting right now. And then the other thing is the traditional center-right alliance is gone. You see independents have shifted pretty greatly more towards Democrats this time, where Republican independent coalition would really help not only in House races and Senate races, but at that national level. And so we're seeing a lot of that. All of those numbers, the margins sort of disappear or flip, and it's also happening in many key states.
So let me also, for the folks who have joined us today, talk about the question I get asked a lot, which is about, well, the polls were all wrong in 2016. Contrary to popular belief, the polls were not all wrong in 2016. What happened in the national vote, Hillary ended the race with a real clear politics average of about 2.2 nationally, and that's about what she won the popular vote by. The other trend that people ignored was in the final 2 weeks of the campaign in battleground states like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, Hillary's trend line was going down like this dramatically in a 14 to 16 day span. Any campaign consultant worth his or her salt would tell you when your numbers are declining like that heading into election day, you're in for a very bad night on election night.
Always the trend line. The trend line is
the trend line, right. Now, Biden's numbers are holding. They're tightening up a little bit with 6 days to go, but he is still right now in Pennsylvania holding about a 4-point lead. In Wisconsin, one poll, forget that poll that came out today that has him with some big double-digit lead in Wisconsin. His average is around 5.5 to 6. And in Michigan, he's +9. If he takes those 3 states off the map, if those numbers hold, and with 6 days to go, that would be a really seismic change compared to what we saw last time. He looks going into this in better shape in the battlegrounds for sure. That's without adding in things, states like Arizona, which I can't remember the last time it voted for a Democrat, but right now Biden's got about a 2.5-point lead. We also see a Democrat in that state, looks like he's heading, Mark Kelly, Gaffe Gifford's husband, heading to win a Senate seat there. So, that's how I see the dynamics going in here. Donald Trump has a Mount Everest to climb right now. And for those who are jittery about the polls, I understand it, but they weren't as off as people thought they were last time. And we'll see in 6 days whether they're off now. But I've been asked over and over again, who would I rather be right now? And I'd certainly rather be Joe Biden than Donald Trump. And that's not to say I'm overconfident, but when I look at this structurally, I look at the way this election has alienated suburban voters from Donald Trump and probably the Republican Party for a bit. I think that, barring any unforeseen event, now we've got a situation in Philadelphia today. I'm sure you're all aware. another incident with police shooting of an African-American person who had mental disabilities. But we'll hear more about that in the news, and we'll see how that plays out. And I would also say that is going to pose a risk for Donald Trump. Trump's handling, going back to the post George Floyd incident, he was getting terrible approval ratings on his handling of riots. We had a majority of Americans did not think Trump respected minorities and people of color. And 5 days out, if he does what he's done in the past, he is just going to reinforce his negative in a way that I think is going to create a bigger problem for him. I don't know, Kevin, if you have anything you want to add to any of that.
That issue because I work on that issue quite a lot closely at Arnold Ventures. We are probably one of the biggest foundations that works in the issue of criminal justice reform. One of the most interesting things about that number is it's not just about African American voters. It is an issue where the numbers change dramatically on the question of racial inequality, racial injustice amongst independent voters, older voters, white voters, and even Republican voters.
And I would add suburban voters. That's the generation.
So that's my main
parents.
point. My main point is that so many to the untrained eye on a lot of this poll discussion is that, well, the racial injustice issue has sort of animated a lot of folks in inner city communities or amongst the African American community. It had as big an impact on voters that you would not traditionally think would see that issue as a priority. And it is what has spurred a lot of bipartisan sort of action and actually coming together around this issue around the country. So it is an issue where many Republicans in races, and if you take a look at Georgia and Kelly Loeffler in the Senate race down there, immediately, and I think reflexively and incorrectly believe that they could run a, quote, law and order contrast message against criminal justice reforms or against some of the protests that are out there. And I think they're going to pay a price as a result. And we have seen other Republicans who are criminal justice advocates, criminal justice reform advocates, not only hold their own, but flourish as a result. So that is an issue that if we're going to look at the next 2 years of policymaking, that's one to watch.
And one footnote on that, and then I want to take questions, and Shannon and Adam, if we can extend the questions if we need to, let's do it. But when we talk about how these issues are animating younger voters and millennials and Gen Z, there is a nexus to the suburban voters. Those are the people who've been raised by suburban parents, right? And to a large extent, not just suburban, but urban as well. But that generation has had an exchange of values that goes down from parents to kids and up from kids to parents more than any other time in history that we've seen when sociologists look at that.
So great point, and similar to the immigration issue. Don't look at the immigration issue as an issue that is about enforcing the law against illegal immigrant community. It is an issue where independent voters, suburban voters, ex-urban voters judge as a value issue for candidates. And so if you have a comprehensive, more open approach, modernized approach to the immigration issue, those voters vote on that issue and they reward you on that issue as a result. And you turn them off with a strident message of anti-immigration.
Great. So Shannon, let's start taking some questions.
Let's go with the first question from our friend Lee Marinoff. This question is to both of you guys. How much do you think we will know on election night? And at what point does a Biden lead convince Team Trump to wrap it up and not go the court route? And also, Kevin, is that a picture of Mickey Mantle over your right shoulder?
I hope it is. It's Sean. That's Sean Madden. I hope he's the next Mickey Mantle.
Kevin and I have also shared a lot of talks about our sons who are pretty good baseball players. So
we talk more about baseball than we do politics, which is a very good thing. I'll take this one. Can I take this one real quick?
Please.
Look, yeah. I think the one thing I'm going to be looking at like Maine 2. Like if Maine 2 is a district where it's, there's there was a strong Biden win in that district. If North Carolina, we start to see signs of that early on in the night. Pennsylvania is going to be a whole mess disaster because of how how they're going to be counting all the mail-in ballots that come in. But so North Carolina and Maine too, if we see like a very strong win by Biden in those, then I think we'll probably know on election night. We'll have a good sense on election night of how the presidential contest went. But the one guarantee that I would offer is that Trump is not going to go quietly. There will not be a concession speech on election night. There will be. I worry that the time between the election day and the inauguration will be amongst the tensest times in our country's history. That sounds probably like hyperbole, but as an Irishman, I always expect the worst. That way, I'm pleasantly surprised when something good happens. But I do worry about that Trump is not going to go quietly, and we will not see very peaceful concession in the first few days of this election.
Great, thanks, Kevin. I see an interesting question from Rob Keller. I'm going to throw it to Joel. Joel, why are polls based on majority voting as opposed to expected electoral results?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. Look, right now, when we talk about polling in battleground states, probably the first presidential campaign that I worked on was Bill Clinton's reelect in 1996. The media pollsters weren't even polling in battleground states then. They only polled nationally. There is a correlation to the national vote and the Electoral College over a period of time, and some of the data analysts can give you that. But obviously, that's where the margin comes into play. It is noteworthy Donald Trump lost the popular vote by the biggest margin of any president who got elected through the Electoral College. So it's not a perfect formula, and you shouldn't mistake it for one. But that's why I talk about the numbers in the battleground states we're looking at. And the reason I mentioned Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, if you take those three states off the map from Donald Trump, which Democrats had won in 6 out of 6 elections before that, the path to victory for any Republican, and Donald Trump in particular, gets even narrower. And that's why you've heard us talk today. Kevin just brought up North Carolina. You've heard about Arizona. Those are states that have voted more Republican than Democrat. I think Obama was the first Democrat in a while in 2008 when he won North Carolina to carry that state. But the tightness in those states and the leads that Biden has there make them remarkable. And I've injected those into the conversations because they play to the very question you've asked, which is the Electoral College. So you've got to get to your 270. And one way you do that, and Trump did that in 2016, is he took some Democratic states off the map from Hillary Clinton. If Biden takes some of those typically red states off the map for Trump, his path to 270 just narrows more and more. So we're looking more at both of those types of polls.
The next question I have is from Ms. Jacqueline Scott Douglas. What is the future of the Republican Party if Trump doesn't win? What's their path forward?
It's a good question. It's probably the one I get asked the most. I believe, and for I think there's empirical and anecdotal evidence to this, but I believe that Trump will have as big an impact, if not a bigger impact, on the profile of the party and how it conducts itself for the next 20 years. And I know that sounds really, that's surprising and shocking for a lot of people. But if you look empirically at the president's approval rating inside the Republican Party, it's anywhere between 85 to 95%. The never Trumper or Trump nose holders, you can fit them in a phone booth. And they are a very small percentage of the overall sort of Republican Party. And the party apparatus right now, the infrastructure of the party, is very much controlled by Trump and his allies. I think he has name heirs in name, in that, like, Ivanka Trump and Donald Trump Jr. and others are firmly sort of seen as folks that will continue to promote and advance the Trump brand and the Trump profile inside the party. But I also think you have party heirs as well. Like, there are DeSantis in Florida and, Kemp in Georgia, and there are governors and there are senators who are all bought in on Trump's, the idea of a Trump party and Trump platform. And I think that will endure beyond election day. So win or lose, this is going to be a party that is fully defined by Trump's hold on the party. The other thing is, if he loses, it will be very similar to a sort of a president in exile. You will see Trump programming the next 30 minutes of your cable television. He will be constantly out giving speeches. He will be a constant source of contrast and criticism against the potential Biden administration. And he is not all of a sudden going to go back to Atlantic City and start opening hotels. This is it. I grew up in New York. Joel grew up in New York as well. But there's one thing I remember from growing up as a kid is that Trump used to have page 6 in the in the New York Post or the Daily News. And then he went to the front page and to the back page. Now he's a global phenomenon. And like most real estate professionals, they're very loath to give up property. And they're going to hold on to it as long as possible.
Yeah,
I want to add one thing on that. There's a great book out called How Democracies Die. It's by 2 political scientists, and they talk about authoritarian regimes and patterns of behavior in the authoritarian itself. They dance around the Trump issue a bit, but what they come to the conclusion of, no matter where this has happened around the world, and it's happening in places in Europe now with Orban, it's happened with Bolsonaro, we're seeing it all over, is authoritarianism gains strength when the gatekeepers fail to do their jobs. I think the problem for the Republican Party going forward is the gatekeepers have failed to do their jobs. Not enough. It's one thing to have the Lincoln Project. It's one thing to call yourself a never Trumper, but the people who are in positions of power to put some reins, pull in the reins and control this is going to stay with them for a longer time. I thought, Kevin, you might have said that, it was going to be as bad as the reaction to Goldwater in the 60s. I think there's, and I don't remember if it was 2008, Kevin, or 2012 when the Republican Party last conducted a quote unquote autopsy.
2012, yeah.
Yeah, well, I think if in this one, they might have to, conduct an exhumation.
It won't be party led, though. It'll be led by a group of folks on the outside. And I think there's a very good chance you could see a political realignment, right? With a very big Democratic night. And any political realignment spurs on or triggers a political reevaluation by those that lost. I think that reevaluation will be taken on by a very small group. And their belief is that for a party to flourish, they have to be the party of ideas, and they have to be the party of reform, and they will try and lead that. But my old boss, John Boehner, used to say, a leader with nobody following them is just a guy taking a walk. And, there'll be people doing it, but there won't be a lot. And it'll be hard to sort of find a titular head for that resistance inside the party, and it'll be a very small group of people. And if you're looking for Mitt Romney to do it, and I used to get that question all the time: is Romney going to lead? Like I don't know if he's the person to lead a revolution, and the others that may, Ben Sass, others who sort of emerged as critics in this time. They don't really have much of an organizing capacity. They don't have many followers, and they don't have the infrastructure to do it. Those are 3 things, if it is going to happen inside the party, that they need. I've yet to see any of that.
I have another question. This one, I know there's a lot of people from the UK on the line. Interesting to hear you guys give the reminder about the anti-establishment drivers in 2016 and similar events across the world back then, Brexit and the refugee crisis. What is your outlook for the coming months? And do you see a potential for a similar backlash against COVID measures building up?
In the US?
Both. Let's address both since
No.
Germany just announced a soft lockdown today.
Yeah, I actually don't believe there'll be a backlash to measures. I think if you look at Donald Trump's ratings on the handling of the coronavirus, that's the hole he dug for himself. Look, most Americans, I'm not saying there aren't pockets around the country where there are people who are resistant to doing the things you need to do. But what are we seeing? We're seeing a lot of spikes in those states. We know that Donald Trump in one of the debates said, people are closing schools. That's terrible. Parents want to send their kids to school. Well, Benenson Strategy Group happened to have done a survey, and only 20% of parents with school-age children wanted their kids back in the classroom. Most of them wanted remote or a little bit of hybrid. I think this is, shaking the confidence, not of the American people, but the confidence in the kind of political rhetoric that defies the reality that people are living with. The vast majority of Americans understand that we've lost over 250,000 people. I mentioned 1 out of 4 people over the age of 50 know someone who's died from this. This is not a casual crisis for a president. Not that any crisis is. It's not a casual event. We've been living with it going on almost a year. We're more than half a year into this. It's not going away. I think if the Republican Party doubles down on Trumpism in related to the coronavirus, we may see them pay a price in some states in this election, but it's not going away. And I think this is one where, more than anything, politicians who don't listen to the pulse of where people are on this issue are just digging a bigger hole for themselves.
I'll be brief on this. Joel is exactly right. It's the crisis of confidence, and that has to be addressed. One of the biggest mistakes over the last few months has been that this is not a failure of imagination when it came to political strategy. This is not a failure of political strategy or a problem with political strategy. This was a governing problem, and political salvation lies in a governing solution. So that's really the answer to your question. Really depends on how a potential Biden administration tackles the first few months or the first 100 days of their administration. The good news for a lot of people who are looking at this from a governing standpoint is, Biden has always surrounded himself with some of the most competent people. Ron Klain is like one of the most competent people I've ever met, right? And he has history of, and he's allegedly going to be or has been rumored to be the next chief of staff. And he led the response on Ebola. So he has a history of management capability and also understanding the bureaucracy and where to find efficiencies in it. So it really does come down to, can they just change and deliver on a more effective government response over the next few months. And it's a very small window with which to deploy the political capital of an electoral mandate in order to do that, because the resistance from critics of the administration and a Trump-led Republican Party will be ferocious. And the only way to quiet it, unify the country and get us out of this crisis of confidence, is a governing strategy.
Thanks. Okay, so I've got a couple more questions I want to try to sneak in. This one is from Amanda Moreno. The current two-party system has become extremely polarizing. The GOP has gone further to the extreme right since the Tea Party movement, and now the DNC pushing more of a progressive movement. Regardless of the outcome of this election, do you see a true moderate third party being able to come to the forefront?
The viability of third parties in this country based on the system, the complexity, the size of the country, the cost of elections is extremely unlikely. The one thing I would take issue with in the question slightly is, yeah, there are definitely more progressive strains in the Democratic Party, but the last time the Democratic Party nominated the more left-wing candidate in a presidential contest was 1972 with George McGovern. Every one of our nominees has been more center-left. It actually is where the party is. There's no question there is a very liberal wing in the party. But by the way, if you want to talk about issues, if you listen to a lot of Republicans, they're still talking about dealing with climate change. Like they're going after Biden on the notion that he says he wants to eliminate fossil fuels. Look, the state of Texas is an oil and gas state in this country. So is Oklahoma. They're two of the three leading producers of wind energy in America right now. Polling in Texas shows that a majority of Texans believe that by 2050, their economy will depend more on wind and solar than it will on oil and gas. That is only 3 decades away. That may sound like a long time to us, but that's a fraction of the century here. The public and the American people understand where these issues are going. And I think this is a challenge for the Republican Party. If you are wrong on dealing with climate and pollution, and that's considered a left-wing issue, well, then, I can't think of an issue where the Republican Party is more and could be more out of touch. And that includes some of their business supporters. There isn't a company in America today that isn't taking steps to deal with that. And so that's probably the one position that they're trying to hang around Biden right now. It's not going to work. Farmers in Iowa, they know what climate change does to their crops. They know Iowa, by the way, is the third largest producer of wind energy in the country. So this is a question of a party that's just, the tail wagging the dog here on an issue like this. And you shouldn't conflate that with going too far left. Take healthcare. By the way, Trump's attacks on Obamacare are idiotic. Even in every poll, a majority of people want to keep Obamacare. You can push your partisan buttons all you want, but that doesn't mean that's where the country is. And here you have an incumbent who, in a crisis, should have had all the advantages, and he's just dug a bigger hole for himself on a host of these issues. So, don't conflate the easy labels about what's left and what's right and where the majority of Americans, who are largely moderate voters, are. They're a plurality of the electorate too. There are more moderates than liberals or conservatives, and Biden is crushing Trump among moderate voters. So I think that also speaks to your question.
And Trump didn't go right on healthcare. Remember, Trump's healthcare platform in 2016 was, we're going to take care of everybody and the government's going to pay for it. He is not a Republican. He is not a Democrat. He's Donald Trump. He sees a system that is transactional and non-ideological, and it's all about what he can do, again, to program the next 30 minutes of the cable news and make it all about him. On the question of two-party system, Paul Begala once gave me the best lesson, and I think summarized the whole idea of a third party best when he said third parties are like bees. They sting and then they die. And if you look back to 2016 and 1992, and even some gubernatorial races in places like Minnesota back in, I think that was 1998, right? They've all stung and then they die. They kind of go away, the idea of a third party. So I do think on the question of how do we find a little bit more of the big middle and where are the incentives for sort of cooperation and cross-party working together. This will be a very blatant pitch for the work that Arnold Ventures does in democracy reform. And I think if you look at the areas where we're sort of modernizing democratic or democracy protocols, there are opportunities there to really sort of challenge the traditional hold that two parties have and partisans have on the overall system. So right now, this year in 2020 election in Maine, ranked choice voting is being used for the presidential election for the first time. So ranked choice voting where where you have a first choice and a second choice, and therefore if somebody doesn't get over 50%, those votes are then counted. That actually has a tendency to sort of contribute more to a broader sort of sense of cohesion amongst what the voters are looking for, and it reduces or minimizes the incentives to really be partisan and attacking opponents, because you may need to be somebody's second choice in order to win. The other thing is open primaries, where you have members of both parties being able to play and vote for candidates. And then gerrymandering reform. There's a number of gerrymandering reform ballot initiatives out there. One of the biggest ones is in Missouri, and then there's another one in Virginia. Having these lines drawn in a more neutral fashion will do a lot towards sending people to Washington who have a bit more of an incentive to work across the aisle and on common issues.
Yeah, I think I could sneak in maybe one last question for you both before we go, Kevin. Do you think that Donald Trump is going to be able to persuade the Hispanic voters by comparing Biden and the Democratic Party to socialist governments in Latin America? Is that playing well? And is it playing well to young voters?
No, I think younger voters we've seen have a tendency to be more open to the idea of or criticism of capitalism and an embrace of socialism. We've seen those numbers shift, and having worked with the corporate community before I was working in Arnold Ventures, that was something that was very concerning to them. And it was numbers, I think we saw them over the last 4 years jump about 10 points amongst college-age voters. So I don't think it'll work with them. I think it works with older voters. I think voters who have a bit more of a historical touchstone with, Cubas and Venezuela and the sort of Cold War, that might be more persuasive. But overall, it's less about big picture ideology about that, and has more to do with your healthcare, your job, and whether or not you feel sort of safe and secure in the direction of the country and optimistic about its future. He is doing much better with Hispanic voters than I imagined in a number of key states. I'm still sometimes at a loss to try to explain that, to tell you the truth, other than there just maybe hasn't been, or there's been maybe taking it for granted in some of these states as a more traditional or a constituency that Democrats can consistently bank on. That might be one of the reasons.
The one thing I would add on that quickly is, as a pollster, it could be a methodological question. I'm not sure that a lot of the public pollsters out there and newspaper polls have bilingual interviewers. I'm not sure they ask country of origin, whether their household is Spanish dominant, English dominant, etc. Hispanics are not one group. It's one of the most diverse groups we have, from national origin, whether they speak Spanish at home or not. There are a whole lot of differences that go into the makeup of Latino voters, much more so than, Caucasian Americans.
All right, well, I want to thank you both for your time today. Kevin, I appreciate you for coming out, and everybody, we will just hold our breath for the next 6 days and see what happens with this election.
Thanks everybody. I'm sorry we didn't get to some of the questions, but they all look great, and I really do appreciate all the questions.
Yeah, thank you all for joining. This was a great conversation. Kevin, thanks again.
Thanks, Joel, as always. Thanks, Shannon.
Send my best to Jacqueline.
Will do. You do the same for Lisa. Thanks.
Thank you.
Be safe,
and thank
everybody.
you for the Mickey Mantle comparison, Lee. I'll tell my son that. He made sure that photo was there for all my Zooms.